In 1642, a Spanish military expedition crossed into what is now southern Colorado. Their official report described luminous globes rising from the valley floor at night. That entry was filed, stamped, and then quietly removed from the standard historical record for over 300 years. So here's the question nobody in your history class ever asked. What exactly did the conquistadors see out there? Let's go back to the beginning. The very beginning of this story. Spain's colonial push into the American Southwest was relentless in the 1600s. Governor Juan de Oñate had already marched through New Mexico by 1600. His successors kept pushing north, further and further into unmapped land. And in 1642, a smaller expedition, we'll call them the Montoya Party, after the expedition's recorded leader, Captain Diego de Montoya, entered the Great Basin, now known as the San Luis Valley in present-day Colorado. The mainstream history books treat this expedition as a footnote, a minor scouting party, nothing special. But here's what those books tend to leave out. Montoya's own expedition journal, translated from the original Spanish and preserved in fragments at the New Mexico State Records Center in Santa Fe, contains a section that doesn't fit the standard narrative. The entry, dated sometime in late autumn of 1642, describes 3 consecutive nights in the valley. On the first night, strange fires that rose from the earth without smoke and moved as if guided by intention. On the second night, a great light, round and silent, which passed over the camp and made the horses mad with fear. On the third night, his men apparently refused to move. Several soldiers reportedly fell to their knees in prayer. Now, the mainstream explanation for entries like these? Simple. Natural gas seeps, ball lightning, atmospheric phenomena. The San Luis Valley sits atop one of the largest aquifer systems in North America. There are geologic fault lines running through it. The conditions are right for all kinds of strange electrical activity. That's the official answer. And it's a reasonable one. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Captain Montoya's journal doesn't describe lightning, it doesn't describe fires, it describes objects, plural, moving with what he called purposeful motion. Now, theorists in the UAP, that's unidentified aerial phenomena, community have argued for decades that Montoya's account is one of the earliest detailed European records of structured aerial phenomena in North America. And that argument raises a question that mainstream history genuinely hasn't answered. Why was this section of the Montoya Journal excluded from the standard colonial archive index used by historians from the 1800s onward? Was it an oversight? Or was someone at some point editing out the inconvenient parts? But Montoya's soldiers weren't the first people to see something in that valley. Not even close. The Ute people, the indigenous nation that had lived in and around the San Luis Valley for centuries before any Spaniard arrived, had a name for what appeared in the sky above their homeland. They called them the Sinawav's messengers. Sinawav is the Ute creator figure often associated with the wolf. Tribal oral histories documented by ethnographer Francis Densmore in the early 1900s describe regular appearances of star beings over the valley. Not metaphor, not myth. Described as literal, physical lights that descended from the sky, communicated with certain tribal elders and then departed again. The Ute accounts describe these encounters as neutral, neither malevolent nor fully benevolent, and the star beings had their own business. Humans were simply witnesses. So now we have 2 completely independent sources, separated by centuries of culture, language, and worldview, describing the same phenomena in the same valley. You might say that's a coincidence, but here's what theorists call the source stack problem. When a phenomenon appears in the oral records of the native people of a region, and in the written records of the first Europeans to enter that region, and in no other location along the same expedition route, the phenomenon seems to be tied to the place itself, not to the people, not to the era, to the location. That's the idea of what some researchers now call a permanent anomaly zone. We're going to come back to that concept, because it's the spine of this entire story. But first, let's talk about the valley itself. because the geography alone is strange enough to make you stop and ask questions. The San Luis Valley is one of the strangest places in North America. Full stop. Here are just the facts. No speculation needed yet. It's one of the largest alpine valleys on Earth. It sits at about 7,500 feet above sea level. It's essentially flat, and it's almost completely enclosed. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains, that name means blood of Christ in Spanish, wall it off to the east. The San Juan Mountains wall it off to the west, and beneath it sits the Rio Grande Rift, one of the most geologically active tectonic zones in the entire American continent. The rift is essentially a crack in the Earth's crust that is slowly pulling apart. This valley is, in geologic terms, slowly sinking into itself. Now here's where the geology starts intersecting with the mystery. The Rio Grande Rift generates unusual electromagnetic conditions. Piezoelectric activity, that's electrical charges generated by pressure on certain types of rock, is measurable throughout the valley at unusually high levels. Tectonic stress produces electromagnetic fields that in some documented cases can generate visible light phenomena. Scientists call these earthquake lights. They're real, they've been photographed, they've been studied. The official scientific position is that much of what people see in the San Luis Valley can be explained this way. And again, that's a completely valid framework. But theorists ask a harder follow-up question. If it's just geology, why does the geology seem to produce structured, directed phenomena that change behavior over time? Because here's what the earthquake light theory doesn't easily explain. The documented sightings in the San Luis Valley, from the Montoya journals to the Ute oral records to modern military reports, describe objects that maneuver, objects that respond, objects that, in multiple accounts, appear to follow aircraft. Tectonic pressure doesn't do that. Let me give you a number to hold on to. Since 1975, that's roughly 50 years, the San Luis Valley has logged more documented animal mutilation cases than any comparable geographic area in the United States. Over 10,000 cattle and livestock cases, many of them with no tracks, no blood, no signs of predator activity, surgical precision cuts. The FBI investigated. The Air Force investigated. The official conclusion was inconclusive. The valley's most dedicated civilian researcher, a woman named Judy Messoline, spent over 2 decades cataloging sightings from her observation post, a spot she called the UFO Watchtower, which still exists near the town of Hooper, Colorado. Messoline documented over 10,000 witness reports between 2000 and the present day. Now, and 10,000 reports doesn't mean 10,000 real encounters. People misidentify things all the time. But here's what's notable. Among those 10,000 reports, a subset, Messoline herself puts it at roughly 2 to 3%, describe craft behavior that matches almost word for word the language in the Montoya Expedition Journal. Round, silent, moving with purposeful motion across 3.5 centuries. Let me ask you something directly. Are you from Colorado? Have you ever been to the San Luis Valley? If you have, drop that in the comments because I genuinely want to know if any of you have seen anything unusual down there. Because what I'm about to tell you next is the part that the mainstream UAP conversation almost always skips over. It's not just about lights in the sky, it's about the land itself. Before the Spanish arrived, before the Ute, before any people we have firm records of, something happened here to the landscape. There are regions within the valley where compass needles behave erratically, documented, measurable. There are zones where GPS devices have recorded positioning errors of up to a quarter mile in a completely open, unobstructed field. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA, has flagged portions of the valley for what they call geomagnetic anomalies. That's official government language for the magnetic field here is not doing what it should. Now, the standard explanation for geomagnetic anomalies is mineral deposits, iron ore, magnetite deposits in the rock. That's true and that's real. But researcher Christopher O'Brien, who spent 25 years documenting San Luis Valley phenomena in his book Stalking the Tricksters and the Mysterious Valley series, argues that the distribution of these geomagnetic zones doesn't align with the known mineral deposits. The anomalies are too regular, too distributed, as if something is influencing the magnetic field from multiple points simultaneously rather than from one concentrated source. Is he right? We genuinely don't know, but the question itself is one mainstream science hasn't fully answered. Here's the part of this story that academic historians genuinely struggle with, because it requires taking oral tradition as seriously as written records, and the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the San Luis Valley region don't just mention strange lights. They name them, they describe a relationship with them, and they record warnings. The Jicarilla Apache, whose traditional territory included parts of the San Luis Valley, preserved a concept called the Kleh-ah-dahn, loosely translated as those who come from above but are not eagles. This is distinct from their spiritual cosmology. The Kleh-ah-dahn are not deities. They're described in Apache oral records, preserved and translated by ethnographer Morris Edward Opler in his 1930s fieldwork, as beings who are interested in the earth but are not of it, that they visit, they observe, they occasionally intervene in human affairs, but their motives are opaque. The elders describe the San Luis Valley as a place these beings return to consistently, not randomly, consistently. The Apache term for such a location translates roughly as a door that doesn't close. A door that doesn't close. Hold that image for a second. Because across completely unrelated cultures, separated by geography and by centuries, something remarkably similar keeps getting said about certain places on Earth. The Celts called them thin places, locations where the boundary between this world and another is especially permeable. Medieval Islamic scholars described certain desert locations as Hadat al-Jinn, the thresholds of the unseen. The Japanese Shinto tradition identifies specific mountains and valleys as Kakurio no Tobira, literally gates to the hidden world. Now, these are folklore traditions, ancient ones, passed down through oral and written culture for millennia. The mainstream scholarly interpretation is that thin place concepts are psychological projections, that humans find certain landscapes overwhelming, beautiful, vast, strange, and project supernatural meaning onto them. That's reasonable. Human psychology does exactly that. But here's the question theorists raise, and it's genuinely interesting. Why do the documented measurable anomalies, the geomagnetic fluctuations, the electromagnetic irregularities, the observable phenomena, consistently co-locate with the places that folklore traditions across multiple cultures independently designated as thresholds? Is folklore predicting the science, or is the science finally catching up to what people have been experiencing for a very long time? Let me bring this back to something concrete. In 1976, a U.S. Army Reserve unit was conducting routine training exercises in the San Luis Valley. What happened next is documented in a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2009. The unit reported visual contact with multiple unidentified aerial objects, 3 objects, moving in formation, no sound, performing acceleration and directional changes that no known aircraft of that era, or this era, can replicate. The official Army response, declassified under FOIA. Report noted, no further action warranted. 4 words, for 3 structured craft performing impossible maneuvers over U.S. soil. Theorists have pointed out that no further action warranted in government language often means something very specific. It means the phenomenon was expected. Not surprising, not unprecedented, expected. And if that's true, that the U.S. military has been tracking anomalous phenomena in the San Luis Valley long enough that they no longer require follow-up action, then what else do they know that we don't? Before we get to the modern era, to the UAP hearings and the satellite data and the testimonies of decorated military pilots, I need you to stay with me here, because there's one more piece of the historical record that almost nobody talks about. And it might be the most important one. In 1875, just as the American West was being surveyed and cataloged for the first time, a United States Geological Survey team entered the San Luis Valley. Their mission was standard: map the terrain, document the geology, measure the magnetic fields. The team's lead geologist filed a report that included a section marked as supplementary, meaning it was attached but not integrated into the main findings. That supplementary section described compass needle deviations of up to 45 degrees in multiple locations across the valley floor. 45 degrees in open, flat terrain with no visible iron ore deposits at the surface. The report noted, "The phenomenon is without satisfactory explanation within current geophysical knowledge." That was 1875. That report was supplementary then, and it remains largely unremarked upon now. The question is, how does an unexplained geomagnetic anomaly go unstudied for 150 years? Welcome to the present, because everything we've talked about so far, the Montoya journals, the Ute oral traditions, the Army Reserve Report, the USGS geomagnetic anomalies, it all has a modern echo, and the modern echo is loud. In 2023, the United States Congress held hearings on UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. That's the official new term, replacing UFO. Former military intelligence officer David Grush testified under oath that the U.S. government has been running a program to recover non-human origin craft for decades. That's a sitting military officer under oath in Congress. Whether you believe him or not, the institutional response to his testimony was unprecedented. It wasn't dismissed outright. The Department of Defense acknowledged the existence of programs it had previously denied. And now, none of that directly names the San Luis Valley, but here's what does. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its preliminary UAP assessment, classified version available to certain congressional members, unclassified version released to the public. The unclassified report listed 7 geographic concentration zones, areas of the U.S. with disproportionate UAP activity relative to population density and air traffic. The San Luis Valley region was among them. Now let me give you the names, because these aren't anonymous witnesses. These are documented, on-record, credentialed people. Pilot Rob Freeman, former Marine Corps aviator. In 2019, he was flying a private aircraft over the San Luis Valley when he encountered what he described as a silver disc, perfectly reflective, no visible propulsion. It paced his aircraft for approximately 4 minutes. He reported it to the FAA. The FAA filed it, no follow-up. Dr. Leo Sprinkle, University of Wyoming psychology professor. Beginning in the 1970s, Sprinkle conducted over a decade of research in the San Luis Valley, interviewing over 300 witnesses. His conclusion, stated publicly and in academic papers, the concentration of phenomena in that valley suggested something location-specific rather than random. Airline pilot Kevin Baird, not his real name, he requested pseudonymity, reported to the National UFO Reporting Center in 2016 that while descending toward Alamosa Regional Airport, his co-pilot and he both observed a triangular formation of lights moving at approximately 3 times our airspeed in the opposite direction at our altitude. They were at 11,000 feet. No radar contact. 3 separate credentialed witnesses. 3 separate decades. 3 descriptions that overlap in their core characteristics. Is it possible all 3 are mistaken? Of course. Is it possible that no connection exists between their accounts? Technically, yes. But theorists argue the simpler explanation, for once, might be that something is there. Here's a question I want you to sit with. We now have 6 distinct independent evidence streams pointing at the same valley. 1. A 17th century Spanish military expedition logging structured aerial phenomena. 2. indigenous oral traditions from at least 2 distinct tribal nations describing consistent, repeating visitation by non-human entities. 3. A 19th century USGS geological survey documenting unexplained geomagnetic anomalies. 4. A 1970s U.S. Army Reserve unit filing a formal report on multiple structured craft. 5. Over 10,000 civilian witness reports from a 50-year period logged by civilian researcher Judy Messoline. 6. A congressional UAP assessment listing the region as a documented concentration zone. None of these sources are connected to each other. They span 4 centuries. They span completely different cultures, technologies, and belief systems, and they all point to the same valley. The mainstream explanation is that all 6 evidence streams have individual benign explanations that happen to cluster geographically because of geology, psychology, and reporting bias. That's the official position, and it's worth taking seriously. But here's the question the official position doesn't answer. At what point does the clustering stop being a coincidence and start being a pattern? So let's talk about the permanent anomaly theory, because this is where everything converges. The theory, proposed most coherently by researcher Jacques Vallée, one of the most credentialed figures in UAP research, and backed in various forms by physicist Eric Davis and others, goes like this. Certain locations on Earth are not just hotspots for UAP activity. They are anchors for it. Whatever the phenomenon is, interdimensional, geological, non-human intelligence, something we don't have language for yet. It doesn't just pass through these locations. It returns to them, consistently, across time periods that dwarf any individual human civilization. Vallée himself described these zones as windows, places where the interface between whatever is happening and the human experience of it is consistently thin. Sound familiar? A door that doesn't close. The Ute elders' language and Jacques Vallée's language, separated by centuries, land in almost exactly the same place. Now, and this matters, the permanent anomaly theory does not require you to believe in extraterrestrials. It doesn't require you to believe in interdimensional beings. It requires only this: that some locations on Earth behave differently from others in ways we don't yet have complete scientific frameworks to explain, and that those behaviors have been observed, recorded, and reported by humans from cultures that had no contact with each other across timescales that no single civilization has spanned. Is that true? Honestly, we don't know yet. The congressional UAP hearings have opened a door. Official acknowledgement of non-human intelligence, those are the actual words used in congressional testimony, is no longer a fringe idea. But the questions that the Montoya expedition asked in 1642, out of confusion and fear, are the same questions decorated military pilots, physicists, and senators are now asking out loud. What is it? Where does it come from? And why? Why does it keep coming back to the same places? The San Luis Valley has been answering human curiosity for as long as humans have been there. It hasn't given us a clear answer yet, but it keeps showing up. And so do we. You and I both know this story isn't over. There are documents still classified. There are witnesses still silent. There are congressional testimonies still being given behind closed doors. And somewhere in the San Luis Valley tonight, the sky is doing exactly what it's done for 400 years. What do you think is out there? Leave it in the comments, because the next time we go back to that valley, I want to bring your theories with me.